Chapter 3. Starting a New Life. When Robinson awoke the next morning, the weather was clear. The storm had passed. He pushed aside the thick branches of the tree and looked out towards the calm sea. He was surprised to see that his ship had loosened from the sandbar during the night and had drifted in with the tide. She now lay against the rocks a quarter of a mile from shore. "How sad!" cried Robinson. "If only my men had stayed aboard, they might be alive now." But Robinson's tears could not help them, nor could they help him either. He had to get out to the ship and take off whatever might be useful to him here on the island. By noon the tide was so far out that the sea so shallow that Robinson had no difficulty swimming out to the ship. He grabbed onto the rope hanging down from the deck, climbed aboard, and began his search. Lucky with what was with him, for all the ship's food was dry and untouched by the salt water. Since he had nothing to eat since yesterday, Robinson began stuffing his mouth, then his pockets with biscuits. But there was more to be taken of the ship besides food, and in order to get everything ashore, he would need a boat. Robinson found some spare masts, which could make a good raft. He tied each one with a rope and began tossing them over the side into the sea. He held the ends of the rope so the masts would not float away. He climbed down the ship himself and began lashing the masts together. He climbed down the ship himself and began lashing the masts together. After several hours, Robinson was able to start loading his raft. First, he piled on all the loose boards he could find on his raft. On top of these, he placed an empty seaman's chest and filled it with food: bread, rice, cheese, dried meat, corn, and some bottles of rum. He covered these provisions with some extra clothes for himself, since his own were mere rags now from the pounding of the sea. Next, he turned his attention to the tools he'd need on shore. He found the carpenter's chest filled with saws, axes, and hammers, and got these down to his rafts too. But he would need arms and ammunition as well as if he hoped to hunt for his food and, if necessary, defend himself against man or beast. He found several muskets, 3 good shotguns, 2 pistols, and an old rusty sword. A barrel of gunpowder and a bag of bullets completed his take. By the time everything was loaded on the raft, the tide had begun to rise and head in towards the shore. The tide plus the wind carried him along the shore until he felt safely caught up in a strong current. He was being pulled away from the place where he had first entered the water. Robinson knew that currents like this often occurred when there was a creek or river nearby. He hoped that this was so, for it would be easier to land his raft along a creek than push it up on the beach. Robinson was delighted when he spotted a deep creek and felt the current pull his raft into it. A little way along, he spied a small cove on one of its banks. It was perfect, deep enough to land the raft and still close enough to the sea for Robinson to watch for a passing ship. Once on shore, with his raft safely tied to the tree, Robinson headed for a steep hill. From the top, he hoped to get a good view of the land around him. Was it an island? Was it the coast of the mainland? He had no way of knowing. Robinson climbed to the top and discovered that the sea surrounded him on all sides. He was on an island, and there was no land anywhere, as far as his eye could see. So he returned to the bank of the creek and set up a hut for himself from the boats that lay on his raft. Then he lay down inside it to rest, but Robinson's mind was not ready to rest just yet. He had to plan ahead and decide what to do next. First, he had to return to the ship for other supplies, and he had to do it soon, for if another storm hit, it would easily break the ship to pieces. Then all would be lost. So Robinson decided that before he did anything else on the island, he would return to the ship as many times as necessary to take off whatever might be of value to him. Every day for the next 3 weeks, Robinson went out to the ship. He brought backs of nails, hatchets, crowbars, scissors, knives, forks, and a stone to sharpen his tools. He also brought a compass, maps, a spyglass, more clothing, blankets, sails, ropes, canvas, and even some coins of gold and silver. Then he added 4 companions for himself: the ship's dog, 2 cats, and a Bible. The 4th week began with a raging stormy night. The following morning, Robinson looked out to sea. The ship was nowhere to be seen, only bits of wreck stuck up out of water at low tide. Now that he was on shore to stay Robinson began to search for a place to build his home. The place he had chosen must be close to fresh water. It had to have some kind of shade from the sun. It had to be safe from wild creatures, either man or beast, and it had to have a good view of the sea, for Robinson still hoped for a passing ship to rescue him. So Robinson started his search. As the days passed, he realized that he had to have some way to keep record of the time he was spending on the island. Since he had no paper or pen or ink, he set up a large post near the shore, and each day he cut a notch into it. Every seventh day, he cut a longer notch through the 6 notches, and so marked off a week, then a month, and then a year. Chapter 4. Robinson Learns Many Skills. Robinson's days of searching for a place to build his home ended when he found a small flat plain on the side of a hill. There was even a spot one away on the side of the hill that looked like the beginning of a cave. It was on the flat plain in front of this spot that Robinson decided to settle. He pitched his tent using some of the sails he had taken out from the ship. Then, for protection, he built himself a fortress surrounding it. The fortress was made of strong young trees, which Robinson chopped down and cut into points at the tips. He drove these into the ground, pointed tips up, in a half circle around his tent. So his fortress began at one side of the hill and ran to the other, enclosing his tent and all his possessions. To get inside his fortress, Robinson built a ladder, which he then pulled in after him. Once his fortress was finished, Robinson began to dig up the earth and rock from the side of the hill to make himself a cave. He needed a cool, dry place where he would be able to protect himself from the sun and rain, where he could store his provisions. Even while he was putting his home in order, Robinson made sure to go out every day to hunt for food. He found many ducks, pigeons, goats, and turtles on the island. He found many ducks, pigeons, goats, and turtles on the island. The meat they provided, plus the goat's milk and the turtle's eggs, became the basis of Robinson's food supply. When he killed an animal whose meat was not good for eating, he took off its skin, dried it, and used it for clothing or covering. Robinson was now ready to be furnished. Robinson's home was now ready to be furnished, but what could a man who had never handled a tool in his life hope to build? Robinson wasn't sure, but he worked patiently with his axe and saw for months. At first he pulled apart everything he made, but finally he developed enough skill to make himself a table and a chair, then some shelves for his cave. Once Robinson had succeeded as a carpenter, he decided to try his hand at farming. He still had the kernels of barley corn he had taken off the ship. This would be his first crop. He found a flat, clear piece of land which had to be dug up and plowed. Since an iron spade was not one of the tools a ship carried, Robinson had to make himself one, and the only material he had available was wood. He found a tree whose wood was quite hard, and even though his wood was difficult to work with, Robinson managed to shape a board into the spade he needed. Therefore, he was able to dig up the ground and plant his crop. But this first crop never grew, for Robinson had planted it at the wrong time of the year, just before the dry season. Since he had only used half his kernels on the first planting, he still had the other half left. His second crop, planted just before the rainy season, sprouted and grew well. Robinson carefully saved every ear of corn when it was ripe. He had to think of replanting and increasing his crop before he could think about making bread from his grain. Bread was not to come until much later, 3 years to be exact. By the time Robinson had been on the island 10 months, he decided to explore the creek as it traveled inland. Along its banks, he discovered fields of wild tobacco and sugar cane, vines of sweet ripe grapes, and trees covered with oranges, lemons, and limes. Of these fruits, the most valuable to him turned out to be the grapes. While all the other fruits had to be eaten soon after picking before they spoiled, the grapes could be hung in bunches from the tree's branches and dried on the sun. Once they dried and became raisins, they could be kept for long periods of time without spoiling. Not only were they tasty, but they were very nourishing as well. The grapes proved especially valuable to Robinson during the rainy season when he was unable to leave his cave or tent for several weeks. When there was a slight break in the weather, he left his home only to kill a goat or turtle which roamed nearby. But the fresh fruits grew too far inland to reach during the rainy weather. By the time 365 notches were cut into Robinson's calendar post, He had learned when to expect the rainy seasons and dry seasons on the island. This was very important in the planting of his crops in order to yield two harvests each year for himself. He found that the seasons of the year were not divided into winter and summer as they were in England, but into rainy, dry, rainy, dry. Knowing what to expect helped Robinson store up his supplies so he would not have to go out too much during the wet months. While he was indoors, he busied himself with enlarging his cave and weaving baskets out of long, thin twigs. These baskets were useful for storing his corn and raisins as well as for carrying out the earth and rock from his cave. During his second year, Robinson made many trips exploring the island. On one trip, he climbed a high hill, the highest he had found so far. The day was very clear, and off to the west, about 40 miles, Robinson spied land. He didn't know if it was another island or the mainland. He didn't know if it was inhabited or not, but he did know that if there were inhabitants, they were savages. For a while he lived in Brazil, Robinson had heard stories about the savages who had inhabited this part of the world. They were cannibals, man-eaters who killed and ate all human beings who fell into their hands. The thought of cannibals made Robinson shudder, and he thanked God that he had landed on this deserted island instead of among the cannibals. During another one of his trips, Robinson found a flock of parrots. He decided to catch one and try to teach it to speak. This he did, although it took old Polly 4 years to learn to call Robinson Crusoe, Robinson Crusoe. And so the second year ended, and the third year began. Robinson's crops were now large enough so that he did not have to use all of them for replanting. He could now begin to think about making his corn into bread, but he had to do a great deal of thinking first, for he had no mill to grind the corn into meal, no sieve to strain it, no jars to store it in, and no oven in which to bake it. First, he began by experimenting with some clay he dug up on the island. He mixed it with water to form a paste, then shaped the paste into jars. He then set the jars out in the sun to dry. His first few jars were ugly, misshapen things that cracked to pieces while drying or caved in from their own weight. After 2 months of experimenting, Robinson succeeded. After 2 months of experimenting, Robinson succeeded in making several small earthenware bowls, dishes, pots, and pitchers. But the two large earthen things he made were so ugly that he would not even call them jars. Now that he had a place to store the meal once it was ground, Robinson had to find some sort of stone on which to grind his corn into meal. The only stone on the island was very soft and crumbled easily, so that wouldn't do. Instead, he cut a block from the same hardwood he used for his spade, then hollowed out the inside. Next, he made a pestle or beater to mash the corn and found that it worked very well. Now the meal had to be separated from the husk or shell. Robinson had no sieve or strainer with which to do this and no thin cloth to take its place. Then he remembered a neckerchief he had taken from one of the chests on the ship. By pulling out some of its threads, he managed to make a strainer that accomplished the job of separating the husk from the meal. Then came the problem of baking the bread. Robinson had no oven, but he did have a clever mind. He hit upon the idea of making two very large earthenware pans. He put his bread in one pan, then covered it with the other. He set his covered pan onto half the coals in a red-hot fire. Then he piled the rest of the coals on top of the pan around its sides. His bread then began to bake. So by the end of his third year on the island, Robinson Crusoe had added baking to the skills he had already learned: hunting, farming, and carpentry.